BME20 Live. HR Director at Software Development Company with 250 employees across engineering, product management, sales, and customer success teams. Had strong feminist beliefs about workplace accountability, passionate about ensuring women's voices were heard and men were held responsible for behavior, posted frequently on social media about importance of believing women's workplace complaints without requiring excessive evidence or documentation, believed that demanding proof or evidence from women reporting men's problematic behavior was re-traumatizing and protected patriarchy, got promoted to HR director specifically because company wanted aggressive approach to harassment prevention after Me Too movement. One of my first priorities was implementing policy that treated women's complaints about male colleagues as credible without requiring corroboration, posted about how requiring evidence or witnesses for harassment claims protected men and silenced women's legitimate concerns. Drafted policy stating that women's reports of uncomfortable interactions with male colleagues would be investigated and acted upon based on their testimony. Policy emphasized that women's experiences and feelings were valid evidence not requiring independent corroboration or verification. Presented policy to executive team, saying it would create environment where women felt safe reporting without fear of not being believed. CEOs seemed somewhat concerned, asking if policy meant men could be disciplined based solely on uncorroborated allegations. I said women's testimony was evidence and that skepticism about their reports was exactly the patriarchal attitude policy was designed to combat. That if company truly valued women's safety and voices, they needed to believe women without requiring them to prove their experiences. CEO approved policy with caveat that investigations should still attempt to gather additional information when available. Rolled out policy in company-wide meeting, explaining that women's reports of uncomfortable or inappropriate male behavior would be taken seriously, emphasized that women would be believed and supported, that company would act on their complaints without requiring extensive proof. First complaint under new policy came from female product manager about male engineer who allegedly made her uncomfortable. Product manager named Jessica reported that software engineer named Daniel had commented on her appearance during team meeting. Following new policy, I immediately met with Jessica, documenting her account as credible testimony, requiring action. Jessica said Daniel had told her, "That's a nice professional look," when she'd worn new blazer to client presentation. That his comment about her appearance had made her feel objectified and uncomfortable in professional setting. I validated her feelings and said I'd address Daniel's inappropriate workplace behavior immediately. Called Daniel into meeting to discuss Jessica's complaint about his comment on her appearance. Daniel seemed confused, saying he'd complimented her professional outfit before client meeting, not made sexual comment. I said Jessica had experienced his comment as inappropriate objectification, which meant it was harassment regardless of intent. That commenting on women's appearance in workplace created uncomfortable environment, even if he thought he was being supportive. Daniel said he'd complimented male colleagues on professional presentation before important meetings without it being considered harassment. I said impact on women was different because of historical objectification. His comment toward Jessica needed to stop. Issued formal written warning to Daniel that would remain in personnel file permanently affecting future opportunities. He seemed frustrated but accepted warnings, saying he'd be more careful about any comments that could be misinterpreted. Second complaint came from sales coordinator about account manager who'd allegedly excluded her from client meeting. Sales coordinator named Michelle reported that account manager named Brian had deliberately left her out of important client discussion. Following policy, I documented Michelle's testimony as credible account of discriminatory exclusion requiring discipline. Michelle said she'd expected to be included in meeting about account she supported, but Brian had met with client alone. That exclusion made her feel like Brian didn't value her contributions and was intentionally sidelining her. I called Brian into meeting about complaint that he discriminated against Michelle through exclusionary behavior. Brian explained, client had requested quick informal check-in during their facility visit, and he'd handled it on the spot. That it wasn't scheduled meeting and Michelle hadn't been excluded, there just hadn't been formal meeting to include her in. I said Michelle's experience of feeling excluded was what mattered, and he should have ensured her participation regardless. Brian seemed exasperated, saying spontaneous client conversation during facility tour wasn't deliberate exclusion of anyone. Issued written warning for creating environment where Michelle felt excluded and undervalued professionally. Third complaint came from junior developer about senior engineer who allegedly mansplained technical concept to her. Junior developer named Amanda reported that senior engineer named Kevin had condescendingly explained basic programming concept. Following policy, I accepted Amanda's testimony that Kevin had mansplained as credible account requiring corrective action. Amanda said Kevin had explained fundamental concepts she already knew when she'd asked question about advanced implementation. That his explanation of basics, rather than answering her actual question, had felt condescending and dismissive. I called Kevin into meeting about complaint that he'd mansplained basic concept to female developer. Kevin said Amanda had asked about implementation, and he'd started with fundamentals to ensure shared understanding before advanced discussion. That he explained basic concepts to everyone before diving into complex topics to ensure effective communication. I said Amanda had experienced his explanation as condescending, which meant he'd created hostile environment through mansplaining. Kevin asked how he could answer technical questions without explaining concepts if explanation itself was being called mansplaining. Issued written warning about communication style that made female colleague feel condescended to and dismissed. Over 3 months, had issued written warnings to 12 male employees, all based solely on female colleagues' testimony about uncomfortable experiences, posted about successful implementation of Believe Women policy, creating accountability for male workplace behavior, got supportive responses from feminists praising approach that centered women's experiences without requiring burdensome proof. Started noticing concerning pattern where male employees seemed increasingly anxious and withdrawn in workplace interactions. Several had stopped having casual conversations with female colleagues beyond absolutely necessary work communications. Some male employees had started requesting witnesses be present for any one-on-one interactions with female coworkers. One morning, arrived at office to find 3 male employees wearing small body cameras clipped to their shirts. Daniel, who'd been warned for appearance compliment. Brian, who'd been warned for spontaneous meeting. And Kevin, who'd been warned for explaining concept. All 3 were wearing visible recording devices during all workplace interactions and meetings throughout office. Called emergency meeting with the 3, asking what they were doing wearing cameras and why they brought recording devices to work. Daniel explained that after being disciplined for compliment, he misunderstood as supportive. He needed protection from future misinterpretations. That body camera would provide objective record of his interactions, preventing complaints based on misremembered or misinterpreted conversations. Brian said, after being warned for spontaneous client interaction, he couldn't have predicted he needed documentation of all workplace activities. That camera footage would show context of interactions protecting him from complaints about normal business activities, Kevin said after being disciplined for answering technical question with explanation. He needed evidence of what he actually said. That recording would prevent his normal communication from being characterized as mansplaining or condescension when it wasn't. I felt shocked and offended, asking if they were recording to intimidate female colleagues or create hostile environment. Daniel said cameras were for their protection, not intimidation. That policy requiring discipline based solely on women's testimony made evidence necessary, that he'd been warned for professional compliment and needed objective record to prevent similar mischaracterizations, told him cameras violated company privacy policy and created hostile environment for employees who didn't consent to recording. Kevin said company didn't have written policy against personal recording devices and state law allowed one-party consent recording. That hostile environment had been created by policy that disciplined them without requiring any corroboration of complaints. I said cameras had to be removed immediately as they made workplace uncomfortable, especially for women who might feel surveilled. Brian said they'd felt uncomfortable being disciplined for normal behavior based solely on uncorroborated complaints. but had complied with warnings, that turnabout was fair play. And if women's feelings of discomfort justified discipline, then men's need for protection justified cameras. Left meeting feeling frustrated and went to CEO about male employees wearing body cameras claiming they needed protection. CEO reviewed policy I'd implemented and circumstances of 3 warnings that had led to camera situation. Said camera response suggested men felt vulnerable to complaints under policy that didn't require corroboration or evidence. The Daniel's warning for professional compliment, Brian's warning for spontaneous meeting, and Kevin's warning for explaining concept seemed concerning. I said those warnings had been appropriate because women had experienced interactions as uncomfortable, regardless of men's intentions. CEO said men's response of wearing cameras suggested they felt policy-created environment where normal behavior could be mischaracterized as harassment. That if employees felt need to record all interactions for self-protection, that indicated serious problem with policy implementation. Week after initial 3 started wearing cameras, 7 more male employees showed up wearing body cameras daily. Total of 10 men across engineering and sales were now recording all workplace interactions and meetings. Posted emergency message to executive team about male employees wearing recording devices claiming need for protection from complaints. CEO called meeting with legal counsel to discuss camera situation and policy that had triggered this response. Attorney said employees wearing cameras was legal under states. One-party consent. Law and company couldn't prohibit it without policy change. That camera proliferation suggested male employees genuinely felt they needed evidence to protect against complaints under current policy, and that pattern of warnings based solely on women's testimony without corroboration had created an environment where men felt vulnerable. CEO asked what specific complaints had led to warnings that triggered camera response from male employees. I explained Daniel had complimented professional appearance. Brian had spontaneous client meeting. Kevin had explained technical concept. CEO seemed incredulous, asking if those normal workplace interactions had really justified formal written warnings in personnel files. I said women had experienced those interactions as uncomfortable, which was sufficient basis for discipline under Believe Women policy. CEO said if compliments, spontaneous meetings and explanations were being treated as harassment. No wonder men felt they needed cameras. 2 weeks after cameras appeared, 15 male employees were wearing recording devices representing over 30% of male workforce. Female employees started complaining that cameras made them uncomfortable and felt like they were being surveilled. Some women said they felt less comfortable raising concerns, knowing conversations might be recorded and used against them. Called meeting with female employees to discuss camera situation and their concerns about recorded workplace. Jessica, who'd complained about appearance comment, said cameras felt retaliatory and intimidating, making her afraid to report problems. Michelle, who complained about meeting exclusion, said knowing she was being recorded made her self-conscious about all interactions. Amanda, who'd complained about mansplaining, said cameras created hostile environment of mutual suspicion rather than trust. Asked if they wanted company to ban recording devices to restore comfortable workplace environment. Several women said yes. But others questioned whether ban would work given cameras were legal and men seemed determined to protect themselves. One female engineer said, honestly, if men felt they needed cameras to protect against complaints, maybe complaints hadn't been as clear-cut as presented. That colleague who'd been warned for explaining concept had always been helpful and patient with her questions. Another woman said male colleague wearing camera had explained he'd been warned for normal meeting behavior and needed protection. That knowing context made her question whether policy was being applied fairly or too aggressively. 3 weeks after cameras appeared, CEO mandated review of all warnings issued under Believe Women policy. Legal counsel reviewed 12 warnings issued to male employees over 3 months since policy implementation, found that 8 of 12 warnings had been for normal workplace behaviors that women had interpreted as problematic, that Daniel's professional appearance compliment, Brian's spontaneous meeting, and Kevin's technical explanation weren't harassment. and that policy of accepting women's testimony without any corroboration or context had resulted in disciplining normal behavior, recommended rescinding warnings that have been based on unreasonable interpretations of normal workplace interactions and revising policy to require investigation, gathering context and corroboration before disciplining employees. I felt defensive, saying rescinding warnings would undermine women's confidence that their complaints were taken seriously. Attorneys said maintaining unjustified warnings created legal liability and had already resulted in 15 employees feeling need for cameras. That camera proliferation was symptom of policy creating environment where men felt normal behavior could be mischaracterized as harassment. CEO approved rescinding 8 warnings, including those issued to Daniel Bryan and Kevin Hood, started camera trend. 4 weeks after cameras appeared, CEO announced policy revision requiring investigation and corroboration before discipline. New policy stated that complaints would be taken seriously through thorough investigation rather than automatic discipline based solely on testimony, that investigations would gather context, interview witnesses, and evaluate reasonableness before determining if behavior warranted discipline. Several female employees were upset, saying revision meant company no longer believed women and was protecting male harassers. But other employees, including some women, expressed relief that normal behavior wouldn't be disciplined based on misinterpretation. Gradually over following 2 months, male employees stopped wearing cameras as revised policy was implemented, with warnings rescinded and policy requiring investigation before discipline. Men felt less vulnerable to complaints about normal interactions. Final count showed that 18 different male employees had worn cameras at some point, representing over 35% of male workforce. 5 months after camera situation, CEO called meeting, saying board was concerned about policy failure and my role in creating crisis. Said my policy of automatic discipline based solely on women's testimony had resulted in 18 employees feeling need to wear cameras. That rescinding 8 warnings proved policy had been disciplining normal behavior based on unreasonable interpretations, and that camera proliferation had damaged workplace trust and created an environment of mutual suspicion. Board asked how I'd allowed policy to be implemented without considering it might result in disciplining normal workplace behavior. I explained I'd been trying to create an environment where women's voices were believed and men were held accountable. That requiring evidence or corroboration before believing women's complaints protected patriarchy and silenced victims. Board said investigation wasn't disbelieving women. It was ensuring discipline was based on actual problematic behavior, not misinterpretation. That my policy had equated believing women with automatic discipline without investigation, which had backfired catastrophically. 6 months after Camera Crisis Board voted to terminate my employment as HR director for creating hostile environment through flawed policy. Said policy requiring discipline without investigation had resulted in warnings for normal behavior, triggering defensive camera response. That 18 employees wearing cameras represented unprecedented breakdown of workplace trust under my leadership, and that insisting discipline without corroboration was only way to believe women showed fundamental misunderstanding of investigation, received termination notice citing poor judgment, creating hostile environment and damaging workplace culture, felt devastated being fired for policy I believed would protect women and hold men accountable, posted on social media about being terminated for believing women and holding men accountable for behavior, got very mixed responses with some feminists supporting my approach and others saying cameras prove policy had been flawed. One commenter said, 18 men wearing cameras means your policy made normal behavior seem risky. That's hostile environment, not accountability. Another said, rescinding 8 warnings proves you were disciplining normal interactions. Men were right to protect themselves. Started therapy to process termination and understand how believe women policy had become camera crisis. Therapist asked me to describe what I'd hoped to achieve by disciplining based solely on women's testimony without investigation. I said I'd wanted women to feel believed and supported without having to prove their experiences were real. She asked whether automatic discipline without investigation actually achieved that goal based on outcomes. I was quiet because camera proliferation and female employees questioning policy suggested it had backfired. She said it sounds like you'd equated believing women with automatic discipline rather than with serious investigation. That Daniel's professional compliment, Brian's spontaneous meeting, and Kevin's explanation weren't harassment despite women's discomfort, and that policy-making men feel normal behavior could be mischaracterized as harassment had predictably resulted in cameras for protection. This was painful realization that I'd created exactly the hostile, suspicious environment I'd claimed to be preventing. Started thinking about 12 warnings I'd issued and which one's attorney had said should be rescinded. Daniel had complimented professional appearance, which wasn't sexual harassment despite Jessica's discomfort. Brian had spontaneous client meeting, which wasn't deliberate exclusion despite Michelle's feelings. Kevin had explained concept before advanced discussion, which wasn't mansplaining despite Amanda's interpretation. In each rescinded case, I disciplined normal behavior because woman had felt uncomfortable, not because behavior was actually problematic. Year after Camera Crisis published article about experience titled, "My Believe Women Policy Led to Body Camera Workplace," detailed how policy of automatic discipline without investigation had led to 18 male employees wearing cameras for protection. That attorney review found 8 of 12 warnings had been for normal behavior, women had misinterpreted as problematic, and that board had terminated me for creating hostile environment where men felt vulnerable to complaints about normal interactions. Article went viral with over 600K, reads an intense debate about believing women versus investigation before discipline. Many HR professionals appreciated cautionary tale about how automatic discipline could backfire, creating defensive environment. One HR director commented essential warning about difference between believing complaints seriously and disciplining without investigation. Another commented 18 employees wearing cameras is clear evidence policy, created environment where normal behavior felt risky. But some feminists criticized articles saying I'd betrayed women by admitting policy requiring discipline without proof was flawed. 2 years after Camera Crisis ran into Daniel, who'd been first to wear body camera after warning for appearance compliment, he said being disciplined for saying nice professional look had made him afraid any interaction could be mischaracterized as harassment. That camera had been only way he could protect himself from future complaints based on unreasonable interpretations of normal behavior. Warning being rescinded had helped but damaged from original discipline, and having to wear camera had affected his workplace relationships. I apologized for disciplining him for normal, supportive comment and for creating environment where he'd felt need for camera. He said he hoped my experience helped other HR professionals understand investigation mattered even when believing women. That believe women should mean investigate seriously, not discipline automatically without considering context or reasonableness. 3 years after Camera Crisis reflected on how believe women policy had created workplace where 18 men wore cameras, realized biggest mistake had been equating belief with automatic discipline rather than serious investigation. That Daniel, Brian, Kevin, and others had been disciplined for normal behavior based on unreasonable interpretations, and that camera proliferation had been rational response to policy. Making men vulnerable to complaints about normal interactions, started consulting work, helping companies implement policies that investigated complaints seriously without automatic discipline. Main message was that my policy had created camera workplace because men felt normal behavior could be mischaracterized as harassment. That believing women meant serious investigation, not discipline, without corroboration or context. One consulting client had been planning similar policy of automatic discipline based solely on women's testimony. My experience convinced them investigation could take complaints seriously while ensuring discipline matched actual behavior. Another client had HR director posting about not requiring evidence from women, which created same vulnerability, helped them understand investigation. Gathering evidence wasn't disbelieving women, it was ensuring fair, accurate outcomes. 4 years after Camera Crisis published book about experience, wanting to help HR professionals believe women through investigation. Detailed complete story from policy implementation to warnings to cameras to rescinded discipline determination, included legal analysis of why investigation was necessary, component of taking complaints seriously, and framework for serious investigation that believed complaints without automatic discipline before gathering facts. Book became required reading in HR programs as case study about believing women versus disciplining without investigation. 5 years after camera crisis, all rescinded warnings had been removed from personnel files. Danielle, Brian, Kevin, and 5 others whose warnings had been rescinded had rebuilt careers, though camera incident affected them. Company had implemented thorough investigation policy that took complaints seriously while ensuring discipline matched actual behavior. No employees had worn cameras in 3 years, since policy required investigation. Gathering context before discipline. Current reflection, 7 years after Believe Women policy led to 18 men wearing body cameras, learned that automatic discipline without investigation had created an environment where normal behavior felt risky. That Daniel's compliment, Brian's meeting, and Kevin's explanation weren't harassment despite women's discomfort. That 18 cameras were rational response to policy making men vulnerable to discipline for normal interactions. That rescinding 8 warnings proved policy had been disciplining based on unreasonable interpretations, not actual harassment. Most importantly, that believing women should mean serious investigation, not automatic discipline without corroboration. That's what I learned from policy leading to camera workplace and being terminated for creating hostile environment. From equating belief with automatic discipline to understanding investigation was necessary for fair outcomes. From dismissing need for evidence to recognizing context mattered for determining if behavior was actually problematic. That's my complete story about Believe Women policy that led to body camera workplace. 7 years after camera crisis, continued consulting, helping companies investigate complaints seriously without automatic discipline. Most impactful work involved HR professionals recognizing themselves planning to discipline without investigation. One HR director had been about to implement policy of automatic action on women's complaints, similar to mine. After hearing complete story about 18 cameras, understood investigation could take complaints seriously without creating vulnerability, revised approach to thorough investigation that believed complaints while gathering context before discipline decisions. Another HR manager had been disciplining based solely on women's testimony without corroboration, like my approach. Worked with them on understanding context, and reasonableness mattered for determining if normal behavior was actually harassment. 8 years after camera crisis, published follow-up research on complaint investigation versus automatic discipline, studied 200 companies comparing those investigating before discipline versus those disciplining based solely on testimony, found that automatic discipline policies had 300% higher rate of employees using recording devices for protection. That investigation policies actually had higher complaint rates because employees trusted fair process would result in appropriate outcomes. Research validated that my automatic discipline approach had predictably created defensive camera response. 9 years after camera crisis, Danielle, who'd been first to wear camera, published article about experience, described how being warned for professional compliment had made him feel normal behavior could be mischaracterized as harassment. That camera had been only protection against future complaints based on unreasonable interpretations of normal interactions. He emphasized that investigation taking complaints seriously was different from automatic discipline without context. Article became widely cited in discussions about implementing complaint processes that were both thorough and fair. Current reflection, 10 years after Believe Women policy led to body camera workplace, learned that decade of helping companies investigate seriously without automatic discipline gave meaning to failure. That 18 cameras had been clear evidence policy created environment where men felt vulnerable to complaints about normal behavior. That rescinding 8 warnings proved automatic discipline had been based on unreasonable interpretations, not actual harassment. Most importantly, that believing women required serious investigation, not automatic discipline without corroboration or context. That's everything learned from 10 years since policy led to cameras and taught me about investigation versus automatic discipline. From equating belief with automatic discipline to understanding investigation was necessary for fair, accurate outcomes. From dismissing evidence as patriarchal to recognizing context mattered for determining actual harassment versus misinterpretation. That's my final lesson about Believe Women policy, leading to body cameras and learning investigation protects everyone. 10 years after camera crisis continued work, helping organizations implement fair investigation processes. Most powerful sessions involved HR leaders understanding difference between believing complaints and automatic discipline. One Fortune 500 company had new HRVP planning policies, similar to mine, requiring discipline without investigation. After comprehensive review of my case, including 18 cameras and 8 rescinded warnings, they abandoned automatic discipline, implemented thorough investigation process that took every complaint seriously while gathering full context, reported higher complaint rates because employees trusted investigation would be fair and higher satisfaction with outcomes. Another tech startup had young HR manager wanting to show commitment to women by disciplining without corroboration, worked with leadership on understanding that investigation gathering evidence was necessary for protecting everyone. They developed investigation protocol that believed complaints seriously while ensuring discipline matched actual behavior. No defensive measures like cameras appeared because employees trusted process would be fair and accurate. Current reflection, 11 years after policy, led to body camera workplace, learned that investigation taking complaints seriously protected both complainants and accused from unfair outcomes. That automatic discipline without context had created exactly the hostile, suspicious environment I tried to prevent. Most importantly, that 18 cameras were evidence my policy had failed by making normal behavior feel risky. That's my absolute final lesson about cameras teaching me investigation matters when believing women